So, good evening, members, and welcome to tonight's event. So, just to introduce Mick very briefly, he's an American politician who served as Director of the Office of Management and Budget from February 2017 until March 2020, and was also the White House Acting Chief of Staff from January 2019 until March 2020. Prior to his appointment within the Trump administration, he served in the South Carolina State Senate, sitting in the House of Representatives, and Mulvaney now serves as a Special Envoy for Northern Ireland. So, a warm welcome to Mick Mulvaney. Great. Yep.
It's nice to be back.
Well, thank you so much for coming, because I know you came in 2019 as well, though we've had a whole pandemic in between.
Yes.
But what I wanted to first sort of start on was your time serving as White House Chief of Staff. So when you took on that role, did you speak to any of your sort of predecessors to get advice on that role? Or was there anything particularly that sort of inspired you during your tenure, or sort of was driving you forward in that period?
Did I speak to many of my predecessors? I did not speak to my immediate predecessor. The White House in late 2018 was a fairly miserable place to work in. The Chief of Staff at that time, John Kelly, a four-star general, had developed a distaste for the president to the point where he was not fit to serve. And it was a miserable environment in which to work. In fact, I don't think General Kelly came to work much of the last several months that he was working. The Office of Management and Budget sits underneath the Chief of Staff. It's an unusual structure within our cabinet, which is I had a dual reporting. I reported to the president and to the chief. So while I was directly involved with the president, I also was within what's called the Executive Office of the President, which the Chief of Staff runs. So I had worked with John Kelly for, I guess, 2 years by that time, because this is the end of 2018. And it was a fairly poisonous place to work. A young man wrote a book, and he said that it was revealed as one of the great secrets of that era of the Trump period, that in the book that John Kelly hated the job, and this was a secret. It's not true. John Kelly told everybody he hated the job on a daily basis. In fact, the favorite thing he used to say is, "I'm leaving today, I might not come back tomorrow." A piece of unsolicited advice for you folks: when you move up in the world and you become a leader in anything that you do, it is a cardinal sin in leadership to let the people who work for you know that you hate your job. Because if you hate your job, they will hate their job as well. And that happened to us. And the president asked me to try and fix that. So no, I did not talk to John Kelly. I did talk to a couple previous chiefs of staff, but they were the first to tell me, and they were correct to do so, that while you can learn a little bit from a previous chief of staff or chiefs of staff, there's only about 20 of us alive. Every president is different, and how every president uses the chief of staff is different. There is no archetype for what a chief of staff is or is not, and there are things you have to do. We can talk about that in a little bit, not the least of which is tell the president stuff he doesn't want to hear. So that's consistent across all presidents, but whether or not you can do a job is not, whether or not you were a good chief of staff to Bill Clinton or George W. Bush wasn't really insightful and instructive as to how to be a good chief of staff for President Trump. So I did talk to them, but I had the advantage of having worked with him for 2 years. So I went into the job eyes wide open. I knew what I was getting into. Reince Priebus, the first chief of staff, did not know the president very well. Reince was the head of the Republican National Committee and had some experience with the president on the campaign trail, but not much. John Kelly had known him only tangentially. John had been our Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security and had seen the president in action a couple times, but I had been with the president on a daily basis. It's not unusual, by the way. Every administration since, I think, Clinton has had a director of the Office of Management and Budget become a chief of staff, simply because that is probably the person within the executive office of the president after the chief of staff who's with the president the most. So you're in there almost daily talking to the president. So that's a long answer to your question, but I did talk to some of my predecessors. It was helpful, but not determinative. And I knew exactly what I was getting into.
Great, and I just wanted to focus a little bit more, because you said you worked with Trump for 2 years, on sort of his management style, so to speak. So how was it sort of like working with with Trump? Sort of how much time did you spend with him? Was he disciplined, or was it sort of as chaotic potentially as sort of people?
I would not use the word
media?
discipline, no, which is why he didn't get along with the generals. And he loved the idea of having generals work for him because he fashioned himself sort of as a general type of sort of personality. But he was the most unmilitaristic and undisciplined person in terms of his management style. Not to say you can't be successful. He managed by conflict, okay? And he is not the only person I've known, a high-achieving person, who does that. What does that mean? It means that instead of getting a team that sort of is all on the same page and get them together and try and get great minds together and try and figure out what are we going to do about this, he would get people who absolutely violently disagreed with each other and put them in a room together. John Bolton, for example, on foreign policy. But on trade, for example, we had some of the most protectionist trade advisors you could possibly find in my country, and you had some of the most aggressively free traders in the office at the same time, to the point where on occasion it very nearly came to blows between the principals yelling at each other over trade policy. And Trump loved to do that. He perceived himself as being a judge, as a mediator, as a moderator. It's sort of like his television program, The Apprentice, where he would sort of sit back, and he always thought that if you were fighting with you, and you were smart, that would bring out the best in you, and he'd get really good information from you and really good information from you, and then he would decide what he wanted to do. So he managed by conflict. It's really, really hard to do and maintain a morale amongst the troops that is positive. And we struggled with that. There are people in that office who hated each other. There's no question about that. There was not a camaraderie that you might have read about with previous administrations. It really was a group that on many, many circumstances, in many, many cases, sort of governed by conflict. And that was his management style. He had other sort of subsets of that, but that would be his overarching management style.
Right.
And by the way, and I don't mean to cut you off, I think, and I hope we talk about January 6th before this is over. I imagine that we will. I think that's one of the things, importantly, that changed towards the end of the administration, after I was gone. Donald Trump was never going to exclude people from his office. If you're on the team, you're welcome to come in the office. We used to have 30 people in the Oval Office at a time to talk about things like trade. The key to being the chief of staff was not to exclude people. You hear the chief of staff described as a gatekeeper. And that's a type of chief of staff. Donald Trump did not want a gatekeeper, okay? And if I'd excluded you from a meeting, he might get mad at me. So what I made sure of, if you were crazy, okay, and looking at you, you might be, I needed to make sure that there was somebody who was sane to balance things out, okay? So if I had somebody in there who was a nut, and we had some, Peter Navarro is nuts, okay? But if Peter was going to be in the office, I needed to make sure there was somebody there to balance things out so that Trump, as he's looking for that conflict to get both sides of an argument, he truly got both sides of an argument. My fear, and it's an educated fear, is that towards the end of the administration, especially after the 2020 election, was that it was only the clowns in the office, and that the normal people, the smart people, were gone or had been excluded and no longer felt welcome. I describe it like this. We began the administration with the president being advised by the former CEO of ExxonMobil and the former president of Goldman Sachs. We ended the administration with the president being advised by a guy who sells pillows on television and a trade advisor who was giving him election memos, and the trade advisor had been caught making up an imaginary friend for his academic work. It's not an exaggeration. If you have your phones, you're allowed to use them here. You can Google Ron Varra, Ronvarra. It is an anagram of Peter Navarro's last name. And Peter Navarro got caught making up an imaginary person, including giving that person a background on the internet. He created this person, okay? This is the type of people that were advising the president at the end. Listen, people always, when I talk about this back home, they say, does that excuse the president? No, it doesn't. The president's always responsible for the people that are advising him, but the staff is also responsible for doing the best possible work. And if you're a guy that sells pillows, and you're a guy who does whatever, and you're opining on the election outcomes, my guess is you're not doing the president very good service. Sorry.
I wanted to also ask you about sort of some of the things that you said about Trump. So during the GOP sort of primary in 2015 and
Sure.
16, prior to his election, you described Trump as a terrible human being.
Terrible human being.
In
Yeah,
an
remember
ordinary
that.
universe, he should be disqualified from the office outright. And you opined that the notion of US-Mexico border wall was absurd and almost childish. So how do you sort of square that with later sort of working with him as his chief of staff?
You know, you're not the only person to ask me that question.
I wonder why.
In fact, the person who'd like to ask me about that the most was the president. We talk about it all the time. Break it down into pieces, and I'll deal with the horrible person last. Put it in context. This was right after, in fact, I think it was the same evening. If you follow American politics, there was one of those October surprises that so often happens when dirt on one candidate or another will come out in the last days before an election. And the evening that the Access Hollywood tape came out, where the president was caught on, I think it may have been video, I know it was audio for sure, saying, you know, when you're rich and famous, you can just grab women by the unmentionables and they'll do whatever. Okay, it was a true low point in American politics. I had a debate that night in my own race, and that was my God's honest, straight out, that was my gut reaction to that, which is that is a terrible person and that should be career ending. By the way, he agrees with half of that statement. He thought his career was over that night. He really did. In fact, there were discussions, I know, within the Republican Party about whether or not we should try and replace Donald Trump because of that comment. Turns out it did not end his political career. That says as much about the electorate these days as it does about the candidates. But he thought that his career was over, and he would tell you that it was the low point of the 2016 campaign, and that it was difficult to even go home and talk to his family about that when that comes out. That's just life. What was the last part about the
Mexico,
wall?
yeah, absurd and almost childish.
Yeah, you know, and we had this discussion. You can't build a wall all the way across the southern border. There's places where it's physically not possible. And whenever we have these discussions, like Mick, it's the principle of the thing. It was, I know that there are places where we would be better served by having technology. We'd be better served by having towers and, you know, ultraviolet whatever, or, you know, night vision whatever, or drones. I get that. But people, they just want to know that you secure the border. And they don't want that level of detail. Tell them you're going to build the wall, and that's it. And that's what we're going to do. And we got a good bit of it built, not nearly as much as we wanted. But yeah, no, we've had very candid conversations about all of those things. It's not like it's the first time I've heard that.
Right. And I also wanted to ask about Trump's first impeachment in regards to sort of the scandal regarding Ukraine. So sort of, do you have any regrets about how that was specifically handled? Or in terms of sort of your interactions with people like Rudy Giuliani, and also the phone call with Zelensky himself, of course?
I wasn't on the phone call with Zelensky. I do remember this. I remember I found out, and this says a lot about how poorly the West Wing was running towards the end of my tenure there. I found out about the text being released the day it was released. There were discussions in the West Wing that I was not involved with where people said, we're going to release this text. I remember sitting with Stephen Mnuchin going through the text because it was going to be released imminently, and I'm like, this is really bad. This is really bad. Okay, we can't say this. And the president's actually, well, this is a perfect phone call. There's nothing wrong with this phone conversation. So, Mr. President, there's absolutely nothing illegal in this phone conversation. We didn't do anything. I was the one who held the money. Okay? I was the Office of Management and Budget, the people who held the money. I knew exactly what we'd done, and I knew it was 100% legal, and it had been vetted by every single lawyer we could find in the Office of Management and Budget. I knew exactly why we did it. I knew exactly how we did it. It was my job to do it. I knew that there was nothing criminal. I looked at that text and said, but that sentence is going to be a political problem. Keep in mind, people forget this. At the time we released the text, there was already a congressional inquiry on whether or not they were going to impeach the president. People have forgotten about this. Okay? They'd actually started this inquiry as to whether or not they were going to impeach him before we released the text. And it had nothing to do with the text. It had to do with the Mueller report and some of the things that had come out in that investigation, which it turns out, by the way, were based in part on lies by the FBI to the FISA report, but that's another story. So I knew it was 100% legal, but I also knew the political environment. And when we put the text out, we were at the UN General Assembly in New York City, and by pure coincidence, and I'm not making this up, we had a meeting with Zelensky that afternoon. And Zelensky had said he didn't feel pressured, whatever. I can't remember exactly what he said. And I walked out of the meeting and left and got on the Acela train to go back to Washington, D.C. And my phone rang, and it was the president. He goes, where are you? Where are you? What are you doing? You're supposed to be here. I said, Mr. President, I got to go back to Washington. He's like, why? I said, because you're going to get impeached. And he went nuts, okay? Don't say that. Don't say that. Don't say it. Don't say that. It's a perfect phone conversation, Mr. President. There's a couple lines in there the Democrats are going to pick up on. Will you do us a favor? They're looking for an excuse to impeach you, and you just gave it to him, gave it to them. And he was very angry with me and hung up the phone. The next phone call I got about 2 minutes later was Kevin McCarthy, who I believe at the time was the minority leader. Yeah, I think because we were out of the majority. Yeah, I'm sure we're out of the majority because the Democrats controlled the House. And he goes, what the hell's going on, Mick? And I'm like, yeah, Kevin, I didn't know about it. He goes, he knows he's going to get impeached, right? And I'm like, well, he does now. And he's not very happy about it. So, no, listen, I don't have any regrets about it. The press conference could have been smoother, but I can assure you that I didn't say what history will say that I said. History, and since we lost elections, and since I don't control the media, I don't write history, unlike Churchill, right? So what the history is that I said, yes, we absolutely held that money up because we were waiting for them to help us out with Hunter Biden and just get over it. Okay? And the reason I know history will say it is because that's what the Democrats said during the impeachment inquiry. Keep in mind, if you go before Congress to speak, before the meetings, you have to put your hand on the Bible and say you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. Members of Congress don't have to say that, and they're not under oath when they talk at a hearing. And they took the words and made it sound like what I said was absolutely we did it, get over it. And that's not what I said at all. So I have no regrets about that. Do I have regrets about the way that we handle impeachment? Yes, I do. Did we know from the very beginning that we were going to win? Yes. Did we make mistakes along the way in how we prosecuted the impeachment? Yeah. But at the end of the day, we knew it was going to happen in the first place. We knew he would win, and we knew we would move on. So it was an unfortunate. It was unfortunate in that, and it worked. It worked. Impeachment worked. It did not get Donald Trump kicked out of office, but it broke the West Wing, number one, to a point where I think it contributed directly to the mismanagement that led to January 6th. And it got us completely distracted from our agenda. And we were not really able to do as much as we wanted after impeachment because all of our energy was aimed in that direction. I'm writing a piece right now. I write for the USA Today. I write for a couple newspaper syndicates in Washington, in the United States. One of the things I'm writing is that I really hope the Republicans don't impeach all of these people after they take control of the House, okay, on a principled basis. Okay? But I know there are people in the Republican Party who think to themselves, you know what, I don't think Joe Biden has committed any impeachable offenses, but if we impeach him, he won't be able to do anything else because he has to defend himself for the next 4 months. Because that's exactly what happened to us. And my fear is that the Democrats learned a lesson that the Republicans will likewise learn, that if you want to slow down your opposition, you simply file articles of impeachment, and it brings the government to a grinding halt. And I don't think that is good precedent to follow.
Great. And I sort of moving on, I suppose, chronologically towards the end of sort of your time as chief of staff. You was acting chief of staff at the time when sort of COVID started to sort of come onto the horizon. Of course, you weren't actually in the White House during the main parts of the COVID crisis, but what are sort of your reflections being in the room with Trump, for instance, when it first sort of came on the horizon that there was this disease spreading in China? And also, do you have any sort of regrets about that time or how it was handled after you sort of left
regrets
office?
No regrets. I mean, I'm not a person who focuses on regrets. Did we do things wrong? Yes, but here's why. We never should have shut down the world. Absolutely not. We should not have done that. And I will take that to my grave, thinking that we will end up paying a price for that is so much higher than what we turned out we could have faced with COVID, that I think history will look poorly upon the decision to close the government. But here's why we did it. I was running the COVID task force before Mike Pence took over. That is the ordinary course of business in the way our government works because it was an interagency sort of effort. So if the State Department is involved in something, and the Health and Human Services is involved in something, and the Department of Justice is involved with something, and the Department of Education, this cross-agency thing, it is normal and ordinary for the Chief of Staff to oversee that, okay? And that was my job. And that was actually sort of the group we had in the early days of COVID. In fact, education was there, and they played a central feature early on in the COVID response because we have about tens of thousands of Chinese students coming to the United States every January, which is when COVID was making itself known. What are we going to do about these kids? So we had the Department of Education there. Here's what we knew. And we didn't know much because the Chinese didn't tell us anything. The only thing the Chinese really told us was that it was a coronavirus. They refused to share any of the really hard science and hard data that we would have needed to do really good work at the time. But they told us it was a coronavirus, and we confirmed that. We had recent experience with two coronaviruses, SARS and MERS, okay? SARS was about 15% fatal. That's really, really bad, okay? On a really bad year, I think in a really bad flu year, the fatality rate's about 0.1 or 0.05%, okay? So if 100 people get it, 15 people are going to die if they get SARS. That's a big deal. MERS was about 35% fatal. Okay? That's a really, really big deal. But we also knew something else about coronaviruses, which is that they were really hard to give to people, okay, and spread, and you weren't able to give it to somebody else until after you had symptoms. Okay? That's what we knew. Okay, so, all right, we got this disease. It could be 15, it could be 35% fatal. That's a really, really big deal. But it's fairly easy, relatively easy to contain. How do we do it? We just simply make sure that no sick people come into the country. And that's what we did. We set up these checkpoints. We consolidated all the airports that had international flights down to 10 or 11, and we set up checkpoints in all these airports with thermal scanners. And if you came through and you had symptoms, you had a fever, we could see that. We'd cult you out and see if you were sick. Okay? And if you came through without any symptoms, you just walked right through. Because SARS and MERS, you can't give it to anybody else until after you're showing symptoms. A couple days later, we got news from northern Italy. There's actually an interesting story about the UK involving that they had easy community transmission. Okay, that's different. SARS and MERS, really hard to move from one person to another. But in northern Italy, it seems like community transmission is relatively easy. That's really bad, 15 to 35% fatal in our minds. And then the oh shit moment, and it really was one of those oh shit moments. I remember when Bob Redfield, at the time, I think he was the head of the CDC, came into our little meeting, our Corona Task Force meeting, and he said, we have a problem. And we said, what is that? He said, we have asymptomatic transmission. And that's the oh shit moment. So now we have a disease. The pieces of information that we have are what? It's easy for you to give it to somebody. It's possible for you to give it to somebody else even before you know you are sick. All of our defenses were set up to deal with people who had symptoms, and this could be 15 to 35% fatal. Okay? That is an existential crisis. Okay? That's the Black Plague, that's everything. This is a world-changing type of situation. And that's why we did what we did. Two things on that in response, in hindsight, which I recognize is 2020. Number one, I am an extraordinary critic of Dr. Anthony Fauci, and will be to my grave, because he was in charge of this. And what he never told us, and I blame myself for not asking. Okay? I have no experience with infectious diseases, but I should have been smart enough, and in fact I was doing nothing but reading about the Spanish flu of 1918 at the time, trying to get up to speed. And I didn't ask him, but he didn't tell us. The textbook response that the CDC in our country, and in every single one of your countries here, okay, is never to shut down the economy. That's not how you do it. The way you respond to a highly virulent infectious disease, respiratory diseases especially, you never shut the economy down, you never shut down a culture, because it's actually more damaging. What you do is you work quickly to identify the most at-risk populations, and you isolate those folks. Different diseases impact different groups differently. This disease, it turns out, attacked the old more than the young. The Spanish flu of 1918 was the exact opposite. It attacked the young more than the old. It has to do with the way the diseases interact with your own immune system. With COVID, the disease killed you. It overwhelmed your immune system. So if you're young and healthy, you had an immune system that could typically fight the disease. In 1918, the disease actually convinced your immune system to kill you. So if you were young and healthy, you were actually more at risk than the old and the sick. That's number one. You never shut down. Tony Fauci never told the President of the United States that. Never told him one time, Mr. President, we are going to recommend we're shutting down the entire economy, and here's why. And he never said, but we want to let you know, this is not how we've trained to do it. This is not our textbook. This is not how we've studied to do it. We're making this shit up as we go along. Okay? Never said that. Secondly, because we never got the good information from the Chinese, to this day we don't have any good information from the Chinese. We did not know what the fatality rate was, and we had no idea that it was dramatically less than 15%. I don't know what the fatality rate is ended up being. It's worse than a really bad flu year, but it's nowhere near what SARS and MERS were. Yes, did a lot of people die? Yes. Was it a tragedy? Yes. I don't know worldwide what the numbers are like, but I think in the state of Florida, the average age of a fatality under COVID was above 70 years old. It attacked old people. And we could have isolated those populations, taken care of them, and allowed everybody else to go about their lives as normally as possible, at least more normally than we did under the circumstances. So, in hindsight, did we make mistakes? Yes, we did. Did individuals fail at their jobs, including myself? Yes, we did. Did other countries contribute to the difficulties? They absolutely did. And I think all of that is wrong. All of that is a wonderful example of how you can make bad decisions when you have bad information. But I don't have regrets about what we did. I mean, if I came to you tonight and said, look, we've got a disease, it could be easy to give, you can give it to somebody before anybody knows you have it, and it could kill a third of the planet, what would you do? You might do the exact same thing that we did, unless you knew that that's not how you're supposed to handle those situations. So yeah, I hope the story gets written. Like I said, I've written these pieces that says I hope the Republicans don't impeach Biden for a bunch of crap. I do hope they do a 9/11 style investigation as to how we responded to COVID, because if it happens again, the world cannot take the same results. The reason you are going to suffer economically, you've already suffered academically. Many of you, or even probably some of your friends, may have suffered psychologically or emotionally. And you're absolutely going to suffer economically because we shut the world down for 3 years. I hope we don't make those similar mistakes again. Anyway, long answer.
Well, I do want to sort of challenge you just on that point. And we actually have got Dr. Anthony Fauci joining us online this term as well.
Yeah.
So we'll hopefully be able to sort of get his perspective on sort of why he made the decisions he
Good.
did. But I mean, some of the criticisms, at least in the UK, has been that the lockdown was not implemented quickly enough. And actually, that if the lockdown had happened a week earlier, we could have saved over 100,000 lives potentially, is up to some predictions. I mean, the US has one of the highest death tolls in the world. So I suppose that I would challenge you on sort of what you suggested about COVID in terms of, do you think that the economy is being weighed too heavily here? Is this actually sort of is this a form of sort of politics that people see as compassionate and responding to the needs of individuals? And I suppose as much as older people, of course, are more vulnerable generally to disease, is it sort of fair to put all of the strain onto them? Actually, should we not, as a wider society, take collective responsibility for looking out for them? Because I mean, the UK did try at points to isolate the elderly, and it wasn't always successful. So yeah, I just want to sort of challenge you.
Yeah, a couple different things. I'm not as familiar
with
with the numbers as I used to be because I'm not in government anymore. But you've mentioned a couple things. First, protecting the old people. I'm not against protecting old people. That's absurd. But you can protect them just as much by isolating them because they are higher at risk with this disease. Again, if this disease had been closer to 1918, then everybody in this room would have been more at risk than your grandparents would have been, because it would have been the disease forcing your own immune system to kill you, okay? So no, it'd be absurd to sit here and say we're going to sacrifice the old for the benefit of the young. That's not at all what this is all about. Number two, I'm not familiar with the numbers now about fatality rates, but I do know the comparison between two states in my own nation that dealt with this disease very differently. Florida had they had a higher fatality rate than New York. New York was probably the quintessential case of a lockdown. Florida is probably the quintessential case of a non-lockdown. Okay? And on its surface, it sounds like there's a causal relationship between those two things. But I'm pretty sure that the average age of fatality in Florida was above 80. Yes, they had a higher fatality rate because they have more old people. And that's math. That's just math. That's not policy. And I still think that we underestimate the non-COVID related costs of our shutdown. We had a guy who I just adored. He's an economist, by the way, who was one of the best advisors to the president that I saw, a guy named Kevin Hassett, who came in with predictions on the number of suicides that we would have in the nation if we locked down. Turns out he was underestimating that. The damage that we have done to our population is hard to measure. You are going to go through a miserable time this winter. We are going to go through a miserable recession in my country. It's almost inevitable, okay? It is related to a certain extent about world events, there's no question. But we are now going through the recession that we should have gone through when we shut down the world. You don't shut down the world with no cost. That's going to cost something. You don't just sort of get scot, we're going to shut down and nobody's going to go to work for 2 years and not have that have real world impacts. We were supposed to go into a deep, deep, deep recession when we shut down the world. And governments, including my own, chose not to do that by spending absurd amounts of money in order to cushion the blow. But all it does is delay it. And you are going to bear more of a brunt than that than my generation is going to. My country is hopelessly in debt. You folks saw what happened to your currency to the extent everybody, I know everybody's not here British, but you saw what happened to the pound just a couple of weeks ago. Was it part of, in response to what the Truss government had come out with? Yeah. But we are going to feel the aftershocks of our decisions about COVID economically, socially, mental health-wise for generations to come. There was data out this week, I don't know if the Americans here follow the American press, about the lower test scores. We've had, for the first time in 20 years, the average ACT score in my country is now below 20. So we've lost an entire generation of advances in education because we put kids out of school for 2 years. That's what, 1/6 of your basic education between kindergarten and high school. So the costs are extreme. So listen, it's a debatable point. There's no question. I'm not saying I'm absolutely right. I'm just saying you asked me what I thought about how we handled it, and this is my opinion. It is an informed opinion. I don't think it's fair to say that we were sacrificing. I would propose we're sacrificing the old people. That's not accurate. But don't underestimate the costs that we put on your shoulders going forward.
Right, and because I'm aware that I want to go to audience questions in about 10 minutes, I'm just going to focus on a few final questions. We've not spoken, of course, about January the 6th and the Capitol riot. So you did argue in a Wall Street Journal op-ed that you thought that Trump would potentially concede if he lost the election. Of course, that didn't turn out to be true. So I was wondering, sort of, how would you have responded to those events if you had still been acting chief of staff? And do you believe Trump has some sort of moral responsibility for what happened on that day?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Okay. But the piece, I get a lot of friction for the piece. I wrote in the Wall Street Journal that if Trump loses, he will leave office peacefully. And it turns out that he didn't. A couple things about that. Number one, that was not a prediction, it was a recommendation. Okay? I happen to know how Donald Trump thinks, and I know how he gathers information. Donald Trump is one of the largest consumers of media that I have ever met. Man only slept about 4 hours a day. He went to bed about 2 o'clock, woke up about 6, and he read the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the New York Post cover to cover every single day, and then watched every single morning news program on cable television until about 10 o'clock, and he came down to the office about 11. He would work till 7, then go back up and read and watch the evening news shows until the wee hours of the morning. I was not in regular communication with the president after the election for a variety of reasons. I felt I had been mistreated in part by folks on the campaign, but that's another story entirely. But I wrote that piece so that he would see it. And I reminded him that he had had the chance to be unpresidential in the past and that he chose not to do so. And I have examples of that I mentioned in the piece. And this was me advising him. It was an audience of one piece. Mr. President, don't, and I didn't expect the violence. And I can convince you, by the way, fairly easily that no one really expected the violence. I get this all the time. Oh, you guys should have known this was coming. We knew it was coming. We knew President was, this guy was nuts from the beginning. This was always going to happen since 2016. The man he's a dictator. He was looking for an excuse to take over. You should have known about it. And we all knew this was going to happen. Okay, that's fine. And I got this question one time from somebody in an interview. I said, yeah, do you know anything about politics? She said, yeah, I think I do. I said, really? Do you think you know more or less about politics than Nancy Pelosi? And she sort of hesitated. She said, what do you mean? I said, well, because Nancy Pelosi didn't anticipate violence. And she doesn't like Donald Trump at all. I can assure you of that. If she had thought that we would go through that level of violence that day, I can assure you the security around the building would have been even heavier than it was. The violence took all of us by surprise. I think if you watch the tapes of the January 6th hearing, and you could see the faces of the members of Congress, they were stunned. This was an out-of-body type of experience. We could not imagine that this was actually happening. And I commend them, by the way, for their conduct during the riots to keep level-headed, because I was watching it. I'd been in the building that morning and went home in the afternoon to watch it on TV, and I was flabbergasted. I was having difficulty processing what I was seeing on TV. I can only imagine the difficulty processing of what they were going through on the ground. But that is to say that none of them anticipated the violence, myself included. I thought the January 6th committee was going to prove that Trump knew about the violence. I thought they were going to try, and they started, and they made some progress on this. I've taken credit. By the way, I've been canceled. I can't speak to a lot of Trump groups anymore because I'm not sufficiently orthodox on January 6th. Think about that. Trump derangement syndrome goes both ways. There are people who's convinced he's the devil, people who's convinced he's the risen Lord, and he's neither of those things. He's an ordinary person. I thought they were going to prove, and they did prove, or at least they showed, that there was criminal activity on that day. That the right-wing extremist groups, the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys or whatever, they committed a crime. And many of them have pled guilty to this, and eventually several of them, I think, will be convicted of that in court. They were going to draw a line, I thought, from those groups to the president, so they could make the case the president not only knew about the violence, he was helping organize it, that he wanted it to happen. I don't think they got there. I think they drew a line from those groups to an inner circle, Steve Bannon, Michael Flynn, who's the nut job? Roger Stone, maybe Mark Meadows. But I thought the last hearing was going to then take it from those folks, and they were going to have evidence that those folks were coordinating with Donald Trump, and Donald Trump knew what was going on. And I don't think they did that. Do I think he's morally responsible for what happened? I think he's morally responsible for his own actions. I think he's morally responsible better for his own inactions. That's why I quit. The 3 or 4 hours that he stood by and did nothing whilst a mob took over our Capitol building is unforgivable for a president. I don't think it's an impeachable offense. I don't think it's a crime. But it was certainly nothing that I wanted to be associated with, which is why I quit. So I think the committee has done a decent job of doing a couple things. The committee's a joke, by the way, when it comes to the politics. It is not a bipartisan committee. Liz Cheney wants to be president. She saw this as a way to become famous, and she's already talking about starting a third party so she can run for president. That's politics in my country. It's politics in many people's country. I testified, by the way. I was called, and they asked me if I wanted a subpoena. I said, I don't need a subpoena. I'll come down, and I testified under oath for about 3 or 4 hours. And I can assure you it was very professionally done. But I've been deposed before. I have done depositions. I used to practice law, and I can assure you that if I'm deposing you, there's somebody from the plaintiff's side and somebody from the defendant's side, and they're both going to ask you questions. And that didn't happen. There was the people who hated Donald Trump, and they asked me questions for 3 hours. Then there was nobody defending Donald Trump at all. And up on that dais, when you've got people on television, there's nobody there defending Donald Trump. It's not a trial. It's a political show for television, okay? That's not to say, however, that they didn't establish, I think, 2 things that have merit. And I thought one of the things they did properly was 95% of the witnesses are Republican, okay? So you can't say that these witnesses are biased against the president. You can, because you can say that about anybody, but it doesn't hold water when Bill Barr, the 2-time Senate-confirmed Republican Attorney General, goes under oath and said, yeah, I looked into all those claims about fake ballots and, flipping switches and bad machines, and they're all bullshit, okay? When he says that, we should listen, because he is not a Trump hater, okay? He doesn't like the president right now, but he certainly doesn't have this derangement syndrome where he thinks it's okay to lie to make the president look bad. He says something under oath, we should listen. And the videos, I thought, were of value, because I'd never seen those before. I don't think many people had. The videos of the actual riots were informative, because there is a narrative out there right now, peddled by Trump, that this was a peaceful protest. You cannot watch, no ordinary person can watch that video and think that is a peaceful protest. So I think they have actually put some good data out there and good evidence out there to allow people to make their own minds up. I do not think you can be a reasonable person and say that Donald Trump should be president. Okay? Donald Trump had a chance to prove that he won the election, and he lost, I don't know how many lawsuits, 50, 60, 100, I can't remember what the number was. Okay? And you have to come to a point in time and say, you lost. And I think the committee gave us evidence that helps us get to that point. And then I don't think you can take the position that it was a peaceful protest, because it wasn't. So I think the committee is woefully inadequate when it comes to being an investigation into the wrongdoing of Donald Trump, but I think it was valuable into getting us better information about the election and about the riot itself.
And sort of following on from sort of your comments on Trump's conduct, of course, there's many rumors circulating that he may run in 2024.
Yeah.
So do you actually want him to win, assuming that he does stand? And do you think the Republican Party has basically become the Donald Trump party, or actually do you think he's going to face serious challenge?
Yeah, I don't want him to run for one reason, which is I think he's the only Republican who can lose. Unless there's something dramatically different in our economy. It's the same here, right? Unless something dramatically different happens between now, and I think your next general election here is the end of 2024, maybe early 2025. Unless something dramatically different happens, the Tories are going out, okay? That's just life. That's the same life we deal with right now. Unless something dramatically different happens in our economy or something happens more broadly in the world, the Democrats are going to lose in 2024 the White House. Okay, they're going to lose the House in 2 weeks. They might lose the Senate. That's a little bit iffier. But they would lose in 2024 unless Donald Trump is the Republican nominee. Because if anybody else runs against any Democrat, pick a name, Biden, pick whatever you like, okay? It becomes a choice between the Democrats and the Republicans. And in that environment that we expect to be in 2 years from now, the Democrats don't have a chance. I've been on the other end of these things, by the way. We didn't have a chance in the House elections in 2018 because the environment was just bad for us. We're talking about health care. We always lose when we talk about health care, and the environment was health care, okay? When there's 10% inflation and the Democrats are in the White House, they're going to lose on a binary choice. If it's Donald Trump, it's not a binary choice. If it's Donald Trump, it becomes a referendum on him, which is exactly what he lost in 2020. No one voted for Joe Biden. Everybody voted either for or against Donald Trump. Okay? By the way, it's one of the reasons that Biden has had such a difficult time being president. He had no political capital of his own. His job was to not be Donald Trump. Okay? And he succeeded at that job, and he's the president of the United States, and good on him, right? But if Donald Trump is the nominee in 2024, we could lose. And I don't want to lose. And I hope he sees that. I don't know if he will. I expect him to run. He can be beaten one-on-one because I think he has that 35% of the Republican base that will vote for him under any circumstances. And if I run against you one-on-one and I get 35%, you're Ron DeSantis and I'm Donald Trump and I get 35%, I can do the math on that pretty easy. I lose, okay? But if you're Tim Scott and you're Ron DeSantis and you're Nikki Haley and you're Kristi Noem and you're Mike Pence and you're Mike Pompeo and I run against all of you, my 35% wins every single time. Okay? There is no unified anti-Trump wing in my party, and there's not going to be. And our primary system, by the way, is mostly winner-take-all. There's some exceptions. But you can win a Republican primary with a really, really hardcore 35%. So if he runs, my guess is he does become the nominee. I don't think, I speak around the world a good bit. People always seem surprised because I usually get asked a question. I think you can ask this either night, by the way. You may have been asking it next. Do his legal problems negatively impact his ability to run and win? Absolutely not. 0%. That doesn't move the needle one bit. And more importantly, and this comes as a surprise, I think, to folks from other countries and to some Americans, doesn't impact his legal ability to stand. You can run for president in jail as a convicted felon. True story. Okay? It's actually happened before, not for president, but for Congress. People have run for Congress from jail. Our Constitution is fairly straightforward. All you have to be is 35 years old and a natural-born citizen, and that's it. The only people that can take away your ability to be president is the House and the Senate together. And I don't think that's ever going to happen with Donald Trump. So people always say, if he gets convicted of stealing those documents from Mar-a-Lago, no, I don't think it moves the needle hardly at all. If he's sitting in jail, might it really, would it encourage people not to vote for him? Maybe. But legally, I just don't think that's going to happen. And it does not impact his legal qualification to run or serve.
I'm going to ask one final question because I'm keen to get to audience members, which is about you spoke about the deep state previously, I believe, in an interview when you was working with Trump. I suppose you sort of referred to it there in terms of sort of Trump's legal problems are sometimes spun as sort of this idea of a deep state sort of out to get him.
Yeah.
So do you still sort of stand by your comments that there is sort of like a deep state out to get Trump? Or do you think this is just sort of a political narrative that he's using to his advantage?
No, it's 100% right. It's true. And I think it's been established. People say they lied. Okay, I will say the lie, but I will fully admit that you can't say somebody else is lying unless you know for a fact their state of mind. Okay, so I'll be more accurate in my words. The FBI gave false evidence to a court in order to get permission to spy on the Trump campaign in 2016. That is an unmitigated and uncontested fact. It happened. Okay, and I'll ask you, if the FBI had lied, shorthand, if they presented false information about you in 2016 in order to get a subpoena to spy on you, do you think they're capable of doing it again? Do they have a credibility problem? By the way, the Los Angeles Times just produced a story about a month ago that made it very clear the FBI did lie to another court in order to get a subpoena to go get a bunch of bank safety deposit boxes. It has nothing to do with Donald Trump, but it has to do with the FBI lying to a court. When the law enforcement people are lying to courts in order to spy on their own citizens or get their own citizens' materials or charge them with crimes, do you think they're capable of doing it again? If they did it to you once, do you think they'd do it to you again? And I think the natural answer to that is yes. Do I think the FBI has a credibility problem? I absolutely do. Do I think the Department of Justice has a credibility problem? They absolutely do. Does it mean they've done it here? No, it doesn't. I have no proof that they've lied about Donald Trump. I have no proof that they've lied about the documents that they say they took out of Mar-a-Lago. By the way, it's a crime. Who's ever leaking that to the newspapers? It's a crime to do that. Under our system, you cannot leak information about ongoing criminal investigations to the press. That is a felony. So someone is doing it, okay? And no one seems to be making a big deal about it, which I guess is another story. I am skeptical. Do I think that Donald Trump is capable of committing a crime? Yes, I do. I think most of us probably are. Do I think the FBI should have a higher standard of proof to go against a former president? I think they probably should. I think they have a difficult credibility problem, right? Which hurts me, by the way. As a conservative with a small c, I want to believe in the institutions. Okay? I believe in the courts. I believe the courts that said Donald Trump didn't win the election were right. Okay? By the way, several of those were Trump judges who said that. I want to have faith in the institutions, but my faith right now as a citizen, especially as a conservative, in places like the FBI, the DOJ, there were allegations. I don't know how far we got down the path. I think some of it may have been proved that conservative groups are targeted by the IRS under the previous administration. That stuff is real, and that should be a concern to all of us because you have to have faith in those institutions if the country's going to continue in a meaningful way.
Well, thank you so much for answering the questions that I sort of tabled. I now look to members, so if you just want to put your hand up, please, and I'll try and pick a few of you to ask some questions. So I'll go for the member on the front row in the blue shirt there. If you just wait for the microphone, please, just so that we can hear you for the recording.
Thank you, sir, for taking the time to come speak with us. My name's James Podicary. I'm from the U.S. So.
How many of you here are Americans, by the way?
Okay.
My question for you, sir, is you spoke on a couple occasions tonight about the limits of the law, but my question has to do with whether America has a character vacuum, essentially, right now. Like
a character vacuum?
Essentially, do our leaders focus too much on what's legal and not on what's right?
Yeah, that's a fair question, and I thought you were going to go a different way, but it's sort of in the same ballpark. There was some polling data that came out over the weekend. NBC did a poll that said that roughly 2/3 of Americans, anytime you do a polling data, it's always sort of hard to, would be okay with voting for somebody that they thought didn't meet up to their moral standards if they were okay with our policies. I just think that's where we are as a society. I think our moral policies as individuals are lower now than they were a generation or two ago. By the way, I recognize the fact that there's actually, I speak with Austin Goolsbee. He's a friend of mine. He's a Democrat economist from the Obama administration. And I was talking about one of the greatest fears I have, which is about the next generation's inability to talk to people that disagree with them on topics. I think it's a skill set your generation is losing. And Austin correctly points out that some of the oldest examples of writing in the world are accounting records, religious ceremonies, and older people complaining about the morality of younger people. So I recognize that I'm now an older person. But I do think the morality is different. I mean, the morality of social media is different than the morality of that I grew up with. You want to have a really interesting read one time? Go on to my Twitter feed at any particular time and go read the comments. By the way, I discontinue the people who use vulgarity, but it's some of the most vile type of debate that I have ever seen in my entire, and it's not debate. It is completely vile. And I just think that society is getting to the point where its morality is different than it was a generation ago. You ask a really good question in general. I don't know if you know it or not, but this is what you're really asking is, does government lead or government follow? And I think I can make the case that government follows. And it should. We're a representative democracy, which means that Washington should represent the people. Every time I go to speak to Republican groups, like, oh, I can't believe AOC is up there. I'm like, look. There is no invisible hand in Washington, D.C. that goes, oh, who is the craziest fucking nutbag out there? It's you, okay? You are coming to Washington, D.C. And I don't care if you're AOC or you're Marjorie Taylor Greene on the other side of the spectrum, okay? There is no invisible, dark, sinister hand that picks that person out of the dung heap of humanity and brings them up to Washington, D.C., okay? There are people in those districts that look at those persons and say, you know what? That's who I want. Send that person. Send AOC. Send Marjorie Taylor Greene. Those people represent their districts. Government may have in the past, I don't know if we've led. Since I've been there, we have followed. We are divided in government because the nation is divided in government. And I think I can go to the next corollary of that, which is if we are weak in our moral failings right now, we are so because so is the country.
Thank you
Did
so
I
much
just
for
drop
your
an F-bomb in the Oxford debate? No, sorry about that.
I think there's been a few along the way, but it's
Okay,
fine. Wow, we've got lots
I've
and
used
lots.
a few keys.
Well,
I know he said shit a couple times, but I'm Irish. That's normal. So,
it's not a problem at all. And wow, we've got a lot of hands. I'm going to try and sort of choose the member with the glasses. Sort of vote. Yep, that member there. Yep.
Thank you. Earlier in your political career, you said that being pro-life is neither political nor ideological. But don't you think that the overturning of Roe v. Wade this year has politicized the female anatomy by taking away a woman's rights to her own body? Don't you think that this has therefore made a woman's body a victim of politics?
I couldn't understand all of your questions, but it's about abortion. So let me see if the resonance on the microphone was a little bit distorted. Talking about abortion and whether or not it should be a political issue. Is that basically your question?
I just asked if you said it's not political, but everything is politicized the female body.
Again, I'm not sure I understand
Basically,
the question.
she was sort of asking, you argued apparently previously that abortion was not politicized. However, she's suggesting that it sort of politicizes the female body. So sort of asking you to reconsider your thoughts on this issue and maybe sort of explain or sort of engage with that.
I'm happy to answer the question. I'm not sure the premise is. I'm not sure I said that abortion isn't political or politicized. It absolutely is. I guess the question is, should it be? And I always, I was having dinner with some members of parliament, and they said, look, we don't understand in this country why y'all are still having a debate in your country about abortion. We settled in the 1960s or something like that. It's a fascinating discussion in my country. And it is not binary. It's not, are you for or against? There's a whole range of things in the middle. For myself, as a devout Roman Catholic, it's a moral discussion, okay? Which is if you really believe, and I recognize the fact that not everybody believes that, Okay? Not everybody believes that Jesus Christ died and was raised after 3 days. I happen to believe that. Okay? I also happen to believe, doesn't make you a bad person for not believing it, doesn't make me a bad person for believing it. I happen to believe that life begins at conception. If you believe that abortion is the killing of a human being under all circumstances, and you may be able to justify certain exceptions to a ban on abortion in your own mind for rape or incest or the life or the health of the mother, but your premise, your basic premise is that you believe this is a person. There's actually a fascinating libertarian sort of argument here, which is like, who is speaking for the child? If you believe that the life begins at conception, then that is a person at conception. It raises some really, really difficult questions, by the way, which we are finally dealing with in my country. People don't realize this outside of the country. In fact, many people in my country don't realize we never passed a law on abortion. We didn't. The Supreme Court found it in our Constitution in 1973, I think. 1973, Roe versus Wade. We never voted on it. If we put a bill on the floor tonight in the House and the Senate to ban abortion, it would fail. If we put a bill on the floor of the House and the Senate tonight to allow abortion, it would fail. Okay? We've never had these debates, and we are starting to have them now. And they are really, really hard. Okay? I think there's a state that is coming up with, if you believe that life begins at abortion, it begins at conception, does that mean that a fetus has constitutional rights? It's a really, really hard question. Are they political questions? Yeah, they absolutely are. Are we politicizing a woman's body? I guess that's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is we're politicizing the child's body as well. And it's a really, really hard discussion. If you're pro-life, you take the position it's the only time where we allow the killing of a person where we don't ask about, I got this language. I'm not going to say that. I'm trying to figure out what I used to give this speech when I ran for office, and I haven't done it for 6 years, so I can't remember. Anyway, do we politicize it? Absolutely we do. Are we going to continue to politicize it? Yes, we will. Is it going to be hard? Yes, it is. Is it going to be healthy for us as a society? I hope so. I really do. And by the way, there have been some fascinating results already. I think in Nebraska, there was a young woman I met, I think from Nebraska earlier tonight. Nebraska had a constitutional amendment. It's a very conservative state that you would think would be more pro-life than the average state. But they had a statewide referendum on whether or not they were going to change their constitution to allow their state legislature to essentially make decisions about abortion. And if they had, it probably would have banned abortion. The state legislature would. And the people voted not to give the state legislature that ability. So in a conservative state, they essentially said, we are not going to let the state legislature ban abortion. It's a fascinating outcome. I happen to think it's a fabulous outcome, even though I'm fervently pro-life, because we finally had the debate. And yes, we politicized it, but we got a decision that the majority of those people who live in that state made. The decision was not made by 9 unelected judges who have life terms. The people who live in that state and that community made that decision for themselves, and I respect that, okay? If I don't like it, I can always leave Nebraska and go someplace else, which is a famous, famous American tradition of voting with your feet. I'm sorry, I don't know if I answered your question directly, but I probably said enough to piss people off anyway, so that's probably the point, right?
Well, thank you so much. I'm so sorry we are out of time now with our event, so we are going to have to call it there. Thank you for some really interesting questions from the audience and for a great discussion.
Thank you,
Mick Mulvaney, everybody.
Thank you.